The knock came just as the sky turned dark. Not loud, but urgent, repeated, unsteady. Trieu Duong froze where he stood. In his arms, Trieu Lum had just fallen asleep, his small body finally resting after a long day. The house was quiet, only the faint sound of wind slipping through the wooden walls. Then, another knock, this time stronger. "Please, open the door." A woman's voice, weak, breaking. Duong's grip tightened instinctively around the baby. His eyes moved slowly toward the door. At this hour, no one should be here. Not in this village, not in this darkness. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice low, cautious. Silence. Then, "I need to see the baby." The words hit him instantly, cold, sharp. His entire body tensed. "What did you say?" His voice hardened. Outside, the wind picked up slightly. And then, "I'm his mother." The world seemed to stop. For a second, Duong thought he had heard wrong. But something deep inside him, something instinctive, told him this was not a lie he could ignore. His jaw tightened. Slowly, he walked toward the door, each step heavier than the last. When he opened it, he saw her. A young woman, soaked from the night air, her hair messy, her face pale, her lips trembling. But her eyes, they were locked onto the baby in his arms, and they were filled with something he couldn't immediately define: pain, guilt, desperation. Duong's expression changed instantly, cold, defensive. "You should leave," he said without hesitation. The woman shook her head weakly. "Please, just let me look at him." Her voice broke. "I've been looking for him for months." Duong's eyes darkened. "Looking?" he repeated. Then his voice rose. "You abandoned him." The word hit harder than any accusation. The woman flinched, her body trembling more visibly now. "I know," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve to say anything." Her eyes filled with tears. "But please, just one moment." Duong took a step forward, his anger rising. "You left a newborn child on the side of the road," he said, each word heavy. "Do you know what that means?" "I know," she cried suddenly. Her voice broke through the night. "I know I'm a terrible person." Silence followed, heavy, painful. The baby stirred slightly. A small movement, a soft sound. Both of them looked down at the same time, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. "If you're watching this right now," Duong said quietly, his voice strained, "what would you do if the person who abandoned your child suddenly came back?" He swallowed hard. "Would you forgive, or would you turn them away?" The woman took a small step closer, her eyes never leaving the baby. "His name is Trieu Lum, right?" she whispered. Duong's eyes widened slightly. "How do you know that?" She gave a faint, broken smile. "Because I named him before I left." The words struck something deep inside him. A crack. A doubt. "No." Duong shook his head immediately. "Anyone could say that." "I have no reason to lie," she said weakly. Then slowly, she lowered herself to her knees. Right there, in front of him. "Please," she whispered. "I just want to know if he's okay." Her shoulders shook. "I haven't slept a single night without thinking about him." Duong stood still, frozen, conflicted. Anger told him to close the door, to protect the child, to push her away. But something else, something quieter, made him hesitate. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Tieu," she answered. The night grew colder, but neither of them moved. "Fine," Duong said after a long silence. "But you don't touch him." Her eyes filled instantly with tears. She nodded quickly. He stepped aside, slowly. Tieu stood up weakly and walked in, each step careful, as if she was afraid the moment would disappear. She stopped a few steps away, just looking. Trieu Lum slept peacefully, unaware, unknowing. Tieu covered her mouth, her body shook, tears fell silently. "He's grown," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Duong watched her closely. every reaction, every movement, trying to find any sign of deception. But what he saw was real, too real. The next morning, he made a decision. "We're going to test it," he said, his voice firm, cold again. Tieu nodded immediately. "I understand." The clinic, the same place, but a completely different tension. The wait felt endless. Duong stood outside, arms crossed, silent. Tieu sat quietly, her hands clenched tightly together. Neither spoke. Until the result came. Positive. The word echoed, heavy, final. Duong felt something inside him collapse. "She is the biological mother." Silence. Duong looked at Trieu, then at Tieu. The world suddenly felt unfamiliar, unstable. "If you were me," he said slowly, his voice low and broken, "would you give him back?" No answer came, because there wasn't one. That night, Tieu didn't leave, not because she asked, but because Duong didn't tell her to. He gave her a place to sit, a bowl of food, a corner of the house. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, just a chance. But deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning, because the truth had just started to unfold. That night, the house did not feel the same. The same stone walls, the same wooden bed, the same faint wind slipping through the cracks. Something had changed. There were now 3 people inside, and none of them could truly sleep. Trieu Duong sat near the doorway, his back against the wall, his eyes open in the darkness. He didn't trust himself to close them. Not tonight. Across the room, Tieu sat quietly in the corner he had given her. She hadn't moved much since evening. Her hands were clasped together tightly, her head slightly lowered, as if she didn't dare to take up too much space in a place she did not belong. And in the middle, Trieu slept, peacefully, unaware that his world had just been turned upside down. Duong's gaze drifted slowly toward Tieu. He studied her again, not as an enemy this time, but not as someone he could trust either. Her clothes were simple, almost worn, her face pale, tired, as if she hadn't had a proper rest in months. But there was something about her, something that didn't match the image of a helpless woman, something hidden, something unresolved. "Why now?" Duong asked suddenly. His voice cut through the silence. Tieu lifted her head slowly. "What do you mean?" "Why come back now?" he repeated, his tone sharper. 5 months. Where were you all this time?" The question hung heavy in the air. Tieu didn't answer immediately. Her fingers tightened, her lips trembled slightly. Then, "I didn't have a choice." Duong let out a cold laugh. "Didn't have a choice?" he repeated. "You had enough of a choice to leave him on the side of the road." The words hit, hard, but Tieu didn't argue. She lowered her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "I know nothing I say can change what I did." Her voice grew weaker. "But please, just listen to me once." Duong said nothing, but he didn't stop her either. Tieu took a deep breath. Her hands slowly loosened, as if she had been holding this inside for too long. "I wasn't supposed to have this child." Duong's eyes narrowed slightly. "My family," she continued, her voice shaking. "They arranged a marriage for me. A man I didn't love, a life I didn't choose." Her eyes turned distant. "I tried to refuse, but they wouldn't listen." Duong remained silent, but his attention sharpened. "I ran away," she said. "I thought if I disappeared, I could escape everything." Her voice cracked. "But then I found out I was pregnant." The room grew colder. "I had no money, no home, no one to help me," she continued, her tears falling silently now. "I lived in places I don't even want to remember. I hid. I was afraid all the time." Her breathing became uneven. "I gave birth alone." Duong's jaw tightened. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered. "I couldn't go back. I couldn't protect him. I couldn't even protect myself." Her voice broke completely. "So I left him. Somewhere I thought someone kind would find him. Silence filled the room again, but this time, it felt heavier. Duong looked at her. Really looked. He had imagined many things. Excuses, lies, manipulation. But not this. "You expect me to believe that?" he said finally, his voice lower now, but still guarded. Tieu shook her head weakly. "No. I don't expect you to forgive me." She looked at Trieu. Her eyes softened instantly. "I just wanted to know he was alive." Duong followed her gaze. The baby shifted slightly in his sleep. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Duong stood up slowly. He walked toward the small table and poured a cup of water. He placed it in front of her. "Drink," he said. Tieu looked surprised, but she took it, her hands still trembling. "Where will you go tomorrow?" Duong asked. She froze, then lowered her head again. "I don't know." The answer was honest. Too honest. Duong looked away. His thoughts began to collide inside his mind. She abandoned the child, but she suffered. She made a mistake, but she came back. "If you were me," he murmured quietly, almost to himself, "would you let her stay?" No one answered. The night stretched on. At some point, Trieu woke up. A soft cry. Small, but enough. Both of them reacted instantly. Duong reached him first, but Tieu had already moved closer. She stopped, just a step away, as if afraid to cross a line. Duong picked up the baby, held him, but his eyes shifted to her. "You can," he said slowly. "Hold him." Tieu froze. Her eyes widened. "Just be careful," he added. She stepped forward slowly, each movement cautious. When Trieu was placed into her arms, her entire body trembled. She looked down, at the child, her child. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Again, and again, and again. Tears fell onto the baby's blanket. Trieu moved slightly. Then, unexpectedly, he stopped crying. The room went silent. Duong's eyes widened. The baby looked at her, not with fear, not with rejection, just curiosity. Something inside Duong shifted. He turned away slightly, because something in his chest hurt. Not anger, not regret, something deeper. If he chooses her. The thought came suddenly, uninvited. Duong clenched his fists. He had spent 5 months building a life around this child, feeding him, protecting him, learning how to be everything for someone who had no one. And now, the one person who had the right had come back. "I need to think," he said suddenly, his voice firm again. Tieu nodded quickly. "I understand." But deep inside, neither of them knew that this decision would not only change their lives, but would force them to face a truth far more complicated than either of them had imagined. The night felt longer than any night Trieu had ever lived through. He sat outside the small stone house, the cold air brushing against his face, but he didn't feel it. His thoughts were louder than the wind, heavier than the darkness surrounding him. Inside, Tieu was with Trieu. For the first time in 5 months, someone else was holding the child he had poured everything into protecting. He didn't know how to feel. Anger was still there, pain too, but something else had quietly grown in between, something he didn't want to admit. Understanding. He closed his eyes slowly. Memories surfaced. The first time he found the baby on the roadside. The first night he stayed awake, afraid the child would stop breathing. The first time Trieu smiled. Every moment, every struggle, every small victory. They weren't just memories. They were pieces of his life now, and letting go of that was like tearing something out of his own chest. "If you were me," he whispered into the night, his voice low and heavy, "would you hold on or let go?" No answer came, because deep down, he already knew there wasn't a perfect answer. The door behind him creaked softly. He turned. Tieu stood there, Trieu in her arms. The baby was quiet, peaceful, as if nothing in the world was complicated. I think I should leave," Tieu said quietly. Her voice was different now, not desperate, not broken, just tired. I've seen him. I know he's safe. That's enough. Duong stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the child, then on her. You're going to leave again? He asked. His voice wasn't angry this time, just searching. Tieu lowered her gaze. I don't have anything, she said. No home, no place I belong. If I stay, I'll only make things harder for both of you. She held Trieu a little tighter. I've already failed him once. I don't want to do it again. Silence fell. Heavy. Real. Duong took a step closer. Then another. Look at me, he said. Tieu hesitated, but slowly. She lifted her head. You didn't come back because you had nothing, Duong said quietly. You came back because you couldn't forget him. Her eyes trembled. That matters, he continued. More than you think. He reached out, gently, not to take the baby, but to steady her shaking hands. I was angry, he admitted, and maybe I still am. He let out a slow breath. But I've also been alone before. His eyes softened. I know what it feels like, to have nowhere to go. Tieu's tears fell silently. Duong looked at Trieu, then back at her. I can't just pretend nothing happened, he said, and I won't give him up. She nodded immediately. I understand, but, he continued. She froze. You don't have to leave. The words hung in the air. Unbelievable. Unexpected. I'm not saying everything will be easy, Duong said, his voice steady, honest. But if you really want to stay, he paused, then finished quietly. Stay. Tieu stared at him, as if she didn't dare believe what she had just heard. I don't deserve that, she whispered. Duong shook his head slightly. Maybe not. A faint, tired smile appeared, but neither did I, when someone once gave me a chance. Trieu moved slightly in her arms, then reached out, toward Duong. That small gesture, that simple, innocent movement, broke the last wall between them. Duong stepped forward and gently held the baby's hand. No one here is perfect, he said softly, but maybe, he looked at both of them. We can learn to become something better. Outside, the wind had calmed. Inside, the small house felt warmer, not because anything was solved, not because the past had disappeared, but because, for the first time, they weren't facing it alone. If this story made you feel something, Duong's voice echoed quietly, like a thought carried into the night, then maybe you understand. Sometimes, family, he looked at the two people standing in front of him, is not about where you come from. It's about who chooses to stay. And under that quiet mountain sky, a broken story did not end. It began again.